Hello and welcome to Behind the Scenes, a podcast where we talk about the intersection of art, culture, and big ideas. I'm your host, Sean Malone, the creator of the Out of Frame video series on YouTube and creative director for the Foundation for Economic Education. Not as usual, I'm here just with me and Jen. Paul could not be here. We're recording this right before Thanksgiving, and he's out with family today. So the rest of us are at home, which is why we're not in our lovely studio right now. Jen, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's cold here, but I'm doing well.
It was cold for a minute here. Now it's been like super nice again, which is wonderful, I feel like. But it's been it's been good. Like things are kind of slowing down a little bit for us. I don't know if like I'm doing a lot of like end of year planning and such, but like all of the other meeting requests that I have really like died down for this week. So I've got pretty much a clean slate for the rest of the day. How's your like coming into the holiday? Feeling okay? Eh.
It's not awesome. Well, I mean, it is awesome in its own way, but it is a very busy time for us. Not only are we doing all of our end of the year strategy stuff and planning and all of budgeting, etc., but also we're also gearing up for the legislative session, which starts in like the middle of January. So we're getting all of our bill proposals together. We're getting all of our plans of action together for how we're going to talk about those, uh, and so on and so forth. So it's actually a very busy time for me right now. Um, but that's
Yeah.
just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty busy time for me personally, but it's actually super nice when I don't have a million meetings, which is like kind of where I'm at the moment. So I'm hoping to sort of continue this trend for a good chunk of December. I'm not really sure if that will happen or not, but we'll give it a shot. But anyway, bunch of out of frame news that I wanna hit real quick. We finally put out a Squid Game episode. So everybody who wanted us to do a Squid Game episode got what they want finally. It seems to be going fairly well. Sort of just being generally punished by YouTube's algorithm aside, like I feel like it's doing okay. Um, and then I'm working on and in a couple weeks, sort of the first, hopefully by the 9th, I think I'll say this on the podcast. Hopefully December 9th, you will see an episode of Out of Frame on The Matrix, which I'm very, very excited about. I'm going to try to do some shorts on that as well. But in any case, we've got a lot going on there. But yeah, I don't know. Things are going well. You know, the other thing too is I was looking at our stats. I'll have to talk to you about this more later, Jen, but I was looking at our like stats from this year versus last year, and it's a little bit depressing because like we've had kind of a down year compared to 2020. But like 2020 was this just massive spike of everybody consuming all of the media. I mean, and you could see this, you know, around the entire world basically. Like the minute lockdown started, one of the weird sort of I don't know if it should have totally been unexpected, but it was a little bit unexpected, I think, for a lot of us, is that like just online media consumption just went through the roof. And so like it looks like we're down from last year, except for if you look at it from the overall trend, we're still up. So like if you look at it from like 2019, 2017, 18, 19, you know, we're doing pretty well. But like when you have to treat that spike as like a massive outlier, which it was.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we've all felt and kind of had to deal with like webinars and with, you know, everybody watching, you know, Netflix shows and watching stuff on Hulu and on YouTube and everywhere else. And I think that things are sort of coming back down to reality. But I also put that as somewhat of a good thing, you know, because it means that like we're getting a little bit back to normal. You know what I mean? For a lot of people like leaving the house and they're not all just trapped inside constantly, which I think people were last year. So I don't know. I'm going to take it as a positive in general. I think on net it's a good thing that people are watching a little bit less streaming media, even though here we are on streaming media. But But speaking of things that are not available on streaming media, Ghostbusters Afterlife is what we wanted to talk about today, and it's one of the films that has only been released so far on in the theaters. So I don't know how many people in our audience have yet had a chance to see it. We will talk to you about our thoughts about that in a second. And I don't know. I still enjoy going to the theater, so I enjoyed going to see this one in the theater. Its theaters are, I don't know, Jen, how crowded your theater was. Mine was not particularly, but I like getting back out.
Yeah, I like getting back out too, and my theater was not particularly crowded, but I also went at 10:30 in the morning on a Sunday in
That'll
Utah.
do it. That'll do it.
So,
Yeah. I had to convince my wife. We were out all day, and I had to convince her to go to like a 9:30 show on a Saturday, 9:30 p.m. show. She really didn't initially want to do, but I reminded her that she would hate me if I drug her to a matinee because then she'd feel like her whole day was gone.
yeah,
So, which often
trade-offs.
happens, especially when it gets dark at 4.
Yeah,
Thanks daylight
there's
savings time.
also that.
But yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about Ghostbusters. So this is Jason Reitman's Ghostbusters Afterlife, starring Paul Rudd, Carrie Coon. I got to read all the names here. Finn Wolfhard. What a great name, by the way. Finn Wolfhard is an awesome name for somebody who got his start in a fantasy series. What a great name. From Stranger Things, we got McKenna Grace, who played Phoebe in this movie,
Hmm.
and she was probably the biggest standout for me in general. Logan Kim playing a character named Podcast, which is amusing.
Personally attacked.
Personally attacked. And Celeste O'Connor playing Lucky. We'll talk about, there are a couple other characters in here that we'll probably have to get into in spoilers, but let's start out with a non-spoilery review. The basic plot of this movie is very simple. Essentially, the movie opens with the death of Egon Spengler, who has moved out to the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma for reasons unknown. And he sort of dies at the hands of a ghost or some kind of supernatural entity. And then his house is left to his now estranged daughter, whose name is Callie. I've got some thoughts about this that I think are a little weird because like they never made it clear in any movie that Egon Spengler had kids or had a family or whatever, so that's kind of a revelation. But anyway, he leaves this old rickety house to his family. They come out and live in it for a little while, and immediately the kids start discovering, not only his old technology, but also ghosts and other, scary things that are happening around the town. And the kids have to get together to figure out kind of what to do with it. So, I mean, that's like about as straightforward a plot as you can get. I actually kind of appreciate it because honestly, like it was actually structured like a film. It was a story told to be a story. It wasn't, 2 hours of like completely disjointed improv, which was the 2016 kind of failed attempt at doing Ghostbusters. But we'll get into some of that later. But Jen, what were your sort of initial thoughts on this movie? Like non-spoilery thoughts.
Non-spoilery thoughts. It was charming. The character of Phoebe was definitely the standout here. McKenna Grace. She was just lovely. And even though I did have some issues with this movie, I think it was still a lovely introduction to the world of Ghostbusters for an entirely new generation of fans. So there we go.
I agree with that. I think that it had there were a lot of aspects of it that were charming. I think, so I don't normally do this before we do reviews of movies, but I went looking at some of the reviewers, particularly ones that were really critical of the 2016 attempt at doing a Ghostbusters movie. And I went to go look at them because I was kind of curious about one thing in particular, which again we'll kind of get to in a minute. But like, but I went to like look at Nerdrotic and Critical Drinker and guys like that who were really, really, really brutal with 2016. By the way, as I agree that they should have been. I've watched that movie now twice. I had to do it for an Out of Frame episode before, and it was awful. I would never inflict that on anyone if I could avoid it. But I wanted to look because the sort of the way that the stories were being told around the criticism was that the criticism was all, sort of driven by misogyny and whatnot. And I do want to get into that in a little bit. But one of the things that I think it was Nerdrotic said was that this is not an Ivan Reitman film. So Ivan Reitman, Jason Reitman directed this movie. His dad directed Ghostbusters 1 and 2 and played a pretty big role in developing the story, along with, of course, Harold Ramis. And look, I'll give credit to Dan Aykroyd for the original concept, but I think we all, well, I don't know if everybody knows this backstory, but basically like Harold Ramis and Ivan Reitman like just completely rewrote the thing. I mean, like it has a lot of the core elements from what Aykroyd wanted to do, but like Aykroyd's version, if you've heard much about it, sounds like it would have been kind of nuts, which is not unlike Aykroyd himself at this point. But this is a much more Jason Reitman type of film. He did the movie Juno, for example. He did one of my favorite movies called Thank You for Smoking. And this is a lot more like that than it is like the kind of 80s, kind of more broad comedies like you might have expected, Animal House and and all that kind of stuff, like other Harold Ramis movies. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely plays on the kind of nostalgia and the schmaltzy kind of like emotion, the pathos of it. But it's charming in its own way. I think it's very charming. I don't think it's a perfect film by any stretch. But it's a heck of a lot better than 2016's version. And I think that it kind of sticks the landing. I guess I would say it that way. Like, I've got a lot of problems with, like, the first 2/3 of the movie, but I think it kind of ends well. Would you agree with that, Jen? Do you feel good about, like, the way that this movie ended?
Yeah, I do. It was a strong ending, and it was positive. It was uplifting. It felt good when you got to the end of this film. And that is really what you want in a movie like this.
Yeah.
So I have no problems at all, really, with the third act. I think it was very well done. I think there were definitely some pacing issues earlier on in the film, in like Act 1 and kind of the break into 2
Yeah.
sort of thing. It was a lot of setup that didn't necessarily have to happen, which was a bit disappointing because the opening scene was outstanding. There was not a single word of dialogue for the first like 3 or 4 minutes of this film, but you
Yeah.
absolutely understood everything that was happening. It made some stakes very clear, and it just set up the whole premise of the film beautifully. And
Yeah.
then it got bogged down in talky bits.
Yeah, it definitely does, and I think that the thing that I would probably most criticize this, I mean, there are some character choices and things that I also want to talk about, but like let's talk about the mom, for example. I think I can do this without really spoiling anything important, but like, so basically, like we're introduced after the opening scene that I totally agree was handled really, really well. We cut to the mother, who we learn is Egon Spengler's daughter. She's about to be evicted, or she is getting evicted, like basically in the scene that we meet her. She seems to be struggling with keeping a job and all of these other things. I don't think you needed that, first of all. Like, I get that there's an aspect of it where you're trying to make it seem like she's got these issues because her dad abandoned her and stuff like that, which fine, whatever. Although now you're kind of making Egon seem like a really, really terrible person, which, we can talk about his reasons for this, but basically, she is not a very good mom, or she's not a very good provider. I guess I should say she's not a terrible mom. She's just not a very good provider for her kids. And I kind of wish that they hadn't done that because it took a lot of runtime to kind of get into all of that, and it was a lot of drama that like really doesn't pay off anywhere else. Like you would think that like once she goes to this town in Oklahoma, she ends up like her first order of business is try to find work, right? First order of business is to get a job, but instead like her son, played by Finn Wolfhard, her son's name's Trevor. Trevor's the one who gets the job, and it's cool that Trevor gets a job and whatever. But like, it's weird that like the mom isn't the one primarily trying to figure this out, especially because she knows when they go to this town that she's moving there. Like she's moving. Like the kids think that they're going to be there for like a week to just deal with their grandfather's estate or whatever, and then they're going to come home. But no, in fact, she knows that they've just been evicted from their apartment, so she has nowhere else to go. She's going to stay here. But her first order of business isn't to like actually find work or figure out what she can do. So I feel like a lot of that is just kind of unnecessary. I would just cut that entirely and just say she's a mom. She's struggling. The kids, she's been left this house. She doesn't quite know what to do with, and they're going to move out there. Like I don't need to know all the rest of it. Maybe there's, she divorced the dad, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But since the story is really about the kids, it just feels like really superfluous and like totally unnecessary. And it just bogs down the story for the first act for no real reason. So I feel like there's a lot of those kinds of things that I would just cut, like just get rid of a lot of that. And then like I think you watched the original Ghostbusters again as well. I did.
Yeah.
I rewatched that yesterday, and every time I've rewatched that film, and I've seen that film, a couple dozen times probably at this point, like the more and especially as I've gotten older, the more I've come to really feel like it's a nearly flawlessly constructed movie. Like I get why, various people may or may not like the comedy, or they may not like the humor, like the style of humor, but as a film, it is tight. Like it is a tight film. Like there's just not much fluff in it at all. Like just immediately we get a sense of the ghost in the New York Public Library. You immediately cut to like Venkman being a sleaze. You get to know Venkman right away. Aykroyd comes in, like Ray comes in, interrupts Venkman's attempt at sleeping with this college girl, right? Which immediately not only gets you a sense of who Ray is because he's so like excited and giddy about the ghost sighting in the library and whatever. By the way, the opening scene is immediately connected to the introductory scenes of the characters, right? Like the ghost sighting in the library is the reason that Ray comes in and interrupts Venkman. But also the fact that Aykroyd's like he's not socially aware enough to know that he's like disrupting this moment, is hilarious. We then, sort of come together with Egon, and you immediately get to know him, right? Like all of these things, like all of the character introductions are handled so well and so quickly that we immediately get into action, right? Like immediately we get into, we now know who all these guys are. We know why they've been evicted from the college. We know why they go into business for themselves. All of these things happen in the span of, 15, 20 minutes. And then we're into the bulk of the movie where they're fighting ghosts. And like this movie is missing that for me, kind of in a big way. Like I feel like this is missing, like they should have just give me the character introductions, get into it, but then let's get into that promise of the premise idea, right? Like just we got to get into like ghosts and ghost hunting and developing that mystery, but it takes a long time to even get back to like the kids are hanging out on the mountain and there's some weird supernatural ghost thing that happens. It takes forever to get back there, and it felt like a slog.
It really does. It really does. And the fun and games part of a story, the promise of the premise, what we're actually there to watch the movie to see, it was so short. It was so
For
short.
sure. It's really only,
And
I would argue it's really only the one scene. Like, I think it's really only
yeah,
the
the
scene
Walmart
of them
scene.
driving through well, the Walmart scene and them driving through the town, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's literally it.
Yeah.
This is a 2-hour movie
Yeah. Yeah.
and you give me two scenes?
Pretty
Like, come
much.
on.
Well,
That was
and
disappointing. That was
honestly,
disappointing.
and the Walmart scene's a little weird to me because, like, okay, so all right, we're gonna start getting into spoilers because I don't want to filter anything at this point. I think let's just talk about
Yeah.
it the way that it is. So like there is a lot that is derivative about this movie, and I don't totally say that in a bad way. I think it could have been smart to maybe move away from the villain that they chose, but they chose to return to Gozer from the first movie. And so the villain again in this movie is the same villain that was at the end of Ghostbusters, the first Ghostbusters in 1984. And the setup for it is very similar. There's a keymaster and a gatekeeper, and they are basically possessed by these demons, spirits, ghosts, whatever, and then they turn into these like devil dog creatures and they run around the town, right? Well, so in Ghostbusters, in the original Ghostbusters, it's Sigourney Weaver and Rick Moranis who inhabit those roles. In this movie, it is the mom, it is Callie, and it's Paul Rudd's character, who for some reason they decided to name Gary Gruberson, which is like almost a fourth wall break level name, to be honest. But in any case, like it's the two of them who are sort of on a date. I think that there are things that are a little bit wrong about this to begin with. First of all, one of the things that made it really interesting to have it be Rick Moranis, and well, actually, there's a few things. First of all, Sigourney Weaver's character Dana and Rick Moranis's character don't really like. Dana doesn't really like Rick Moranis, but he is trying to date. Oh, he's kind of trying to flirt with her a whole bunch, you know. And so when they become the keymaster and the gatekeeper, because there's like a sexual aspect to it that has to be consummated. And so it's weird. It's like, well, Dana doesn't want this, and like he kind of would want this, but he's too awkward and too weird and everything else. And so it's a weird pairing with Paul Rudd and the mom, Carrie Coon's character. Like, they're dating already. They're kind of already dating, or they're flirting with each other already, and it's going well. So having them be that, like, doesn't kind of add the same tension. And then, everything else that kind of happens is, sort of plays out similarly. They have to sort of choose the form of their destruction and all of that kind of stuff. And I think in this case, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Men, for example, like they don't really emerge from anything other than just the nostalgia. So all that whole Walmart scene for me is just kind of odd. It's like Paul Rudd's by himself, and then he sees these Stay Puft guys, which is funny, but like it didn't really connect. Like there are a lot of things in there that just don't fully connect for me.
Yeah, it didn't add a whole lot to the story to
Well,
have
it's a cute
that
idea
situation.
too.
It's
Like,
very cute and it was actually pretty funny. But how did
but
this further
where
the
they come
plot?
from?
What
Well,
did
and where
this
they come from,
did
right?
did this raise the stakes at all for us? No,
No,
not really, but it
no,
was fun to watch.
yeah.
And yes, when in doubt, err on the side of awesome, but
But I also think that like I think Nerdrotic said this, and I think this is sort of right. Like the Walmart was like weirdly empty too. Like there's no other
yeah.
people. And granted, it's supposed to be late at night. Maybe it's past midnight or something where it's pretty thinned out. But still, like if you're gonna have a scene, so like I kind of think the Walmart scene is kind of like what in the original Ghostbusters, the ghosts roaming New York City was going to be like. Once everything gets released, because oh God, we got to talk about Walter Peck from the original Ghostbusters as well. But like from the original Ghostbusters, basically Walter Peck, who's a EPA representative, foolishly releases Egon's like ghost storage containment and all of the ghosts that it contains back into the city. So all of the work that they did rounding up ghosts and capturing them and storing them in this sort of ghost jail, they're all now free. They're everywhere. They're going nuts. And so it's pandemonium in New York. And I feel like the Walmart scene should have been that to some extent. It should have been just a piece of like utter pandemonium now that the seal has broken from this like mountain where all the ghosts have been, all the souls of these miners and everybody else have been trapped for, a century. And then you could have the Walmart be like just this madhouse with all these people running around everywhere, but it's really just Paul Rudd. And so that gets a little weird. So I feel like the scene, I don't know, it's just awkward to me. Like that kind of stuff like just doesn't quite work. Now, once you actually get into it with the kids all being together and figuring out, the technology and getting into the third act, I think it all kind of comes back together and it's good. But yeah, I don't know. I've got kind of issues with the rest of it in that regard.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. It is very weird that some of some of these scenes did feel very disconnected from each other. And they were put in there simply for the sake of nostalgia and member berries. And that's kind of it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's an awful lot of that. And again, so I don't think a lot of that is necessarily a problem per se. Like, I don't think it's all badly handled. And in
oh
fact,
no.
I would say that this movie probably does. I mean, for as much nostalgia as it kind of crams into one movie, I think it actually handles it better than a lot of movies do. Like, it doesn't, like Star Wars did this a lot. Like all the new Star Wars movies did a lot of like hanging a lantern on these nostalgia bits, right? Like there's a lot of these
Hmm.
moments where it's like, look, the Millennium Falcon, you'll remember the Millennium Falcon. Let's all come in. We're home, all this kind of stuff. This movie doesn't really do that. It's a lot more subtle. There's a lot of things that sort of come up, but it's just like, hey, when Egon died, he dropped the PKE meter on the floor, and then when they arrive in the house, like Phoebe finds it and picks it up, which is like, okay, yeah, that's fine. When Finn Lockhart, when Trevor goes out to the barn and finds these old junky cars, like there's one that's covered by a tarp. He pulls the tarp off, or the tarp blows, I guess, a little bit and reveals a little hint of the, of the Ghostbusters logo and stuff like that, which is like, yeah, it's cool, but it's like, it's not going like, reveal, look at this, the Ecto One, you guys are all supposed to remember this and feel something like really, really nostalgic about it. But anyway, yeah, I want to talk about this movie in comparison to some of the basically to its predecessors. To its predecessors. We already talked a little bit about the pacing. I kind of want to talk about this thing, something that we've talked about on the show a few times, is this idea that like Hollywood seems to have lost the plot on who is a hero and who is a villain, what makes somebody morally a hero. And I kind of have an issue with this movie a little bit as well. Like, there's a lot of really reckless behavior in this movie that is sort of presented as heroic. And like they go through the town and they just rip up the town with proton packs and stuff. And they don't really even know what they're doing. They don't even fully know what the stuff is or how any of this works. Paul Rudd contributes to this because he's like a science teacher who's just like, hey, whatever, let's just release the ghost from this trap. And he's the only one who knows what all this stuff is, at least to some degree, because he grew up, he's old enough to have remembered the events of the first movie. So there's a lot of like general recklessness. Now, I think what's interesting is that I would compare it to, like have you ever seen the epic rap battle of Ghostbusters versus Mythbusters? Because first of all,
Yes.
you should if you haven't. But secondly, there's a line in there where the Mythbusters are talking about how Walter Peck was right, and that they have unlicensed nuclear reactors and all this kind of stuff. And it is true. It is a gag in the first movie that they're wearing unlicensed particle accelerators on their back, and it is a great joke. Just a wonderful, wonderful joke in the first movie. They're all sort of back away from Ray in the elevator. But like, the thing is, Egon was pretty careful and he was pretty thoughtful about all of this stuff, and he built a containment system, and all of it was working until Walter Peck, the guy from the EPA, comes in, not having any idea how any of this stuff works, decided to shut it down because as a representative of the government, essentially he wanted to exert some power and control over the situation. It's really a good bad guy in this case, because the movie like this doesn't need like a mustache twirling villain. Like, it doesn't need like a, because you've got ghosts and you've got the supernatural threat and everything
Yeah.
else. But if you're going to have a human bad guy, it's going to be the one who puts the monkey wrench in the machine that wrecks everything so that they actually really have serious problems. And that's basically what Walter Peck does. When he comes back in and shuts down the containment unit, he releases pandemonium, right? Dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. And so here, though, it's like almost self-inflicted in a way, because it's like they're not really careful about any of this, and they end up they deliberately choose to open the trap. They open the trap, and it is I think it's the gatekeeper. Yeah, it's the gate. I think it's the gatekeeper spirit.
One of the two.
That they release. One of the two that they release onto the world, which sets off the whole chain of events that leads to Gozer returning to Earth. And it's like, I kind of like the world where the Ghostbusters didn't screw it up. You know what I mean? Like, I like the world where it's not the Ghostbusters' own fault that the villain is able to escape and do damage. Now, again, I say that obviously, like, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is Ray's fault and things like that, but like, the form of the Destructor was going to be chosen somehow, right? Like, there was no escaping that at this point, and they didn't cause Gozer to be released, And in fact, Egon spent his whole life. That's the big twist of all of this, is that Egon spent like the last 20 years or whatever trying to save the world from the rise of Gozer. I don't know. It kind of bothered me that like they just kind of, they're just kind of recklessly releasing ghosts.
Yeah, there wasn't a clearly defined human antagonist here at all.
Mm-mm.
It was just them versus the ghosts. And then you kind of had to have the context of the first Ghostbusters movie coming into this film to understand why Gozer being released back into the world is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Like, that is just assumed knowledge in this movie.
Yep.
And it worked for me because I've seen Ghostbusters 1 and 2 many times. But not everybody who's watching this movie is going to have seen a 37-year-old film.
Yeah. I know. It's that part of it. I think that's where the nostalgia stuff sort of falls to pieces. Like, when you were so reliant on people's knowledge and experience of the first movie, it starts to wreck your story a little bit. And I think that we have that as kind of a problem here. But let's talk about this versus the 2016 version, because the 2016 version,
oh man,
I would argue, is an unmitigated train wreck. And I will say, like, this in comparison to that is just night and day for me. Like, there is an actual story here. They don't, like, there are funny moments that are organically funny. They're written to be funny. They're not just, four SNL cast members just like improving for, literally, I watched a thing with Paul Feig, and he said that sometimes they do 5-hour takes where they let the cameras roll for like 5 hours, and they just let these girls just like improv away until, and Hemsworth and everybody else. Like, you're just like, you've got Melissa McCarthy and Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones. And it's just like, 5 hours, really? And that, like, first of all, that's the best you got out of 5 hours. But secondly, you can't cut together a coherent story from that. Because who knows what tangent they're on when the funniest thing happens in that 5 hour session is something that has no connection to anything else. All you're doing from that point as an editor is trying to desperately find some way to connect it back to the previous scene. And there's like no way to do it. And then, Dan Aykroyd even said in one of his interviews that they did like $40 million worth of reshoots on that movie, which of course they did, because they got like disconnected scenes that they had to like figure out how to like, go from one to another. Like, there's just terrible way to make a movie.
So I went and saw 2016 Ghostbusters in the theater with some friends.
I feel bad for you.
Yeah, that's what I did. That was a choice that I made. Mistakes were made. But, like, I don't remember a single line from that movie.
No.
I don't remember the plot. Like, the only thing I can really remember is that Chris Hemsworth was a ditz. And that's it.
And he was, like, the funniest part of that movie.
It.
By the way, he was basically the best part of that movie was Hemsworth.
Yeah, but they did him so dirty.
Oh yeah,
like
no. Well, there's so many things about that movie that just failed on so many levels, and one of them for me is like I believe so. Part of the reason that one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this piece of it was because Ghostbusters Afterlife, I think, does a really, really good job of treating the source material with a lot of reverence, probably too much reverence, creating an opportunity for a decent handoff between, Bill Murray and Ernie Hudson and Dan Aykroyd to the kids, to the new generation. It also introduces a whole bunch of new characters, and they are, by any measure, like, really diverse in the way that we talk about diversity and representation in films. And yet, this is why I went to Nerdrotic and Critical Drinker and guys like that to look at their reviews, because I kind of wanted to know if they had anything to say about the fact that you had two female Ghostbusters, one of whom is black, one of whom is autistic, so like neuroatypical. You've got a Korean kid, and then like the white kid, boy. In Finn Lockhart's character. So you've got like a really diverse mix of what are now going to be the modern era of Ghostbusters. We assume we're going to be sort of the modern era of Ghostbusters. Nobody said a word about it. Everybody said that gosh, I lost track of her name already. I apologize. McKenna Grace was great. Everybody had positive things to say about all the kids, generally, except for Finn Lockhart, actually. And I think that's mostly because I just feel like he just doesn't have a lot to do. Like, he's not really that important to the story in general. But
yeah, that was a writing issue, not an acting issue.
No, he would have been fine if he had a little bit more going on. And I feel a little bit the same way about Lucky, the other girl. They were kind of going for, like, he was trying to have her be his girlfriend and whatnot. And it was one of these things from the first act that I just feel like you should have trimmed down. Like, you could have found a better way to do a lot of that. But in any case, you have a very diverse cast, and everybody seems to be pretty happy with all of those choices. Like, certainly the choices for actors and like the core idea of having these kids come together and all of that seem to work pretty well. And none of these guys who got blasted by Paul Feig and Sony and everybody else and were called misogynists and whatever else have had anything negative to say about, McKenna Grace, for example, who you could, if that was your motive, right? Like, you would have just as much a problem with this movie as you would have with 2016, except for 2016, it didn't have any of the same problems that 2016 had. it didn't. First of all, it didn't make like a politically topical villain, because the villain in 2016 was a misogynist, like basement dwelling internet troll, basically. Like that was the villain. That was the bad guy of that movie. Like it was meant to poke
I didn't
fun.
remember that.
Yeah, he was, because it doesn't matter, because it was completely forgettable and awful and just badly handled and everything else. But I just thought it was interesting that like all of the same critiques, if they were true about the critics of the Ghostbusters 2016, should have applied to this movie. But you don't see the same reaction. You see a very different reaction from those guys. So I don't know. I think that's pretty telling to me, that like there's a lot of what Paul Feig and what Sony was doing with 2016 was more coping and trying to like find a reason why their trailer that looked and just was awful, like why it was getting reviewed so poorly, why it was getting so many dislikes, because widely, one of the most disliked YouTube videos of all time, right? But I think the actual answer is much more straightforward. The answer is it was terrible, you know, like, and the movie was terrible. So there you go.
Yeah, and that is kind of the climate we found ourselves in here lately, is that like the moment you begin criticizing a piece of content,
Yeah.
people assume the absolute worst about your reasoning for it.
Which is weird.
And like, oh, you just didn't like the casting because you don't like women, or you don't like black
Right.
people, or
Right.
you just want it all to be stories about straight white cis men, you hater. I'm like, well, no, that's not really what my jam is, but I do want
No.
good content. But nobody lets other people make that argument anymore. Like,
Right.
there's so much pushback and just assumptions about why you're criticizing a thing, instead of like from like a philosophical point of view, instead of examining, well, maybe this piece of content does have issues. Like,
Yeah.
that is not the default assumption anymore. And it makes me very, very sad, because it makes it very, very difficult to have conversations with other people
Well, they're
who
bad
you
faith.
should be
Right?
getting. Yeah, it's all in bad faith. Like, I run into this in like the Facebook groups that I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't say anything about anything because someone's
Yeah.
going to pick a fight with me, assuming things that are not in evidence. And it's infuriating.
Yeah, people bring an awful, and I think this is true across our society in general right now. Like, people bring a lot of their own baggage into every discussion they have. And so there's just all of these assumptions that, like, well, you didn't like this because you're this label, right? Like, because I've determined that you're this person, and therefore I can't conceive of any reason that you would possibly disagree with me other than you've got this identity that I dislike or whatever. And it's just like, or you could we could just talk about it point by point, and we could talk about whether or not I'm right that, like, for example, Ghostbusters 2016 was a disjointed mess that really didn't connect and didn't have a clear story. Or that, like, one of the things I went back to, like, I accidentally, just because it autoplayed, ended up watching a chunk of the Plinkett review of Ghostbusters 2016, which is also worth watching, by the way. And he talks a lot, like, throughout that whole review, like, Mike Stoklasa's whole point in all of that is that, like, they step on their own jokes constantly. Like, instead of letting the scenes breathe, because it's all improv based, it's like immediately Melissa McCarthy is like talking over a moment that needs space. And so, like, there are all these good ideas for jokes. Like, one of the examples that stuck out to me was, like, they're sort of doing that scene where they're testing the equipment for the first time, and she fires, the little proton stream from the proton pack, and it's kind of like, pew, and it's like a weak stream, basically. And so it's a little bit of like it's like a little bit of a risque weak stream joke, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a fine joke. It's a funny idea conceptually. But instead of just allowing it to be like a week womp womp, like the week stream happens and it's like, oh, okay, that didn't reach the ghost she was trying to get to, and it's a funny image and it calls, all these other things. Immediately, Melissa McCarthy starts quipping, oh, weak stream, that really didn't. It's like, just stop. Just stop. Like, let it go. Let it breathe. It's okay for a joke to breathe. And then the counterexample he gave was where in the first Ghostbusters movie, in the original Ghostbusters, they're in the hotel, the hotel, and they're in the hallway, and like a maid, like a housekeeper, like makes some noise behind them, and they all just like blast her immediately and like blow up her cart, and like all the walls get ripped up and everything. She's on the floor, and she's like, what are you doing? And it's the response is super quiet. They all just, sorry ma'am, sorry. And then they just let it breathe for a while. And so you just sit with this like, look, they just destroyed this thing for no reason. And it's funny and it works and it doesn't step on itself, And I think this movie at least did a pretty good job of that. Like, I think Ghostbusters Afterlife doesn't fill up screen time with just jabber, in the way that the 2016 version did. But let's wrap this up and then get into a bonus section, because I think there's some good stuff to talk about. What are your sort of final thoughts on this movie?
This movie is definitely worth watching, especially if you're a fan of the original Ghostbusters. This is not the train wreck that the 2016 reboot was. This feels more like a natural continuation of the first two movies, just, like 30 years later. And it largely works. It largely works. Are we gonna star rate this without Paul?
Oh yeah, we can star rate this. It'll just be R2 though.
Yeah. I'll give this 0.75 stars.
Same. I was gonna say I'll give it 3/4 of a star in this case.
Yeah.
I think that's a 1.5 solid star right there. I don't know what Paul would say about this. We can get Paul to chime in, and then we can put up a star rating for Paul in the final thing. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I think this is worth watching. I don't know that I would like rush out to the theater and watch it again, for me. But look, it's coming into Thanksgiving. You may be fully occupied with things like The Witcher and whatnot, but I think that's coming out right now. Or wait, no, The Witcher is not till next month. Never mind, you don't have The Witcher yet. So, Ghostbusters is a good choice. We're gonna be talking about Encanto next week, and that's coming out. But like, honestly, you're gonna be home with family. This is one you could totally watch with your family for the most part. Certainly, I mean, Jen we talked about before not having any reason to make it PG-13, but like, honestly, this one is much milder in general than the 1984 Ghostbusters. So if you're going to watch that one with your kids, you can definitely watch this one with your kids.
I took my 11-year-olds. They were fine.
Yeah. But I do think there were some missteps, and I do wish that there were some aspects that were better. We didn't really talk about the ending. The ending is really just a love letter to Harold Ramis. And, and honestly, I found a lot of it to be predictable, but I was still moved by it. I think it was still really nice to see essentially Phoebe being the granddaughter of Egon and being able to sort of see his hand helping her along, figuring out some of the things with the technology and everything else. And then having him actually kind of on screen at the end was really, it was kind of touching, I thought. And then to have all the other guys come out and kind of be there, I was really, I see why they would do this one in character rather than what kind of happened with the 2016 version. I get why they wanted to be a part of this more than they seem to want to be a part of the other one. But anyway, yeah, I think that's it. I agree. I think it was pretty good. Not the greatest of all time, but I think it fits in. and it looks like they've already greenlit a sequel, so they're working on it. So, but yeah, that's the end for the main part of the show. If you are a subscriber on Patreon or Subscribestar, stick around. We're going to do a bonus section. We're actually going to talk about some themes that carry over from this episode. So I think it'll be kind of interesting, particularly from the final scene of Ghostbusters Afterlife. But if you're not a supporter on Patreon, please check us out at patreon.com/outoframeshow or subscribestar.com/outoframeshow. And if you're not quite ready for that, make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, the whole deal, and join our Discord, where we have a lot of conversations about stuff like this all the time. So thanks for watching or listening, however you're consuming the podcast, and we'll see you next time.